There's a cloud a lot of people carry without being able to name it. Not sadness, not regret, not quite loneliness. Just a low-grade dissatisfaction that doesn't lift even when everything, by any reasonable measure, is fine. You know what I mean. You've built a life, you raised your kids, you kept your faith, mostly. You worked for decades and you have something to show for it. And yet there's this undertow, a quiet restlessness that lives just below the surface of ordinary days. You don't talk about it, because talking about it sounds like ingratitude. And ingratitude, in your world, is a moral failure. So you don't say anything. You get up, you pour the coffee, you go through the motions of a life that looks, from the outside, like it's working. And somewhere in the background, almost too quiet to hear clearly, there's the question, what is wrong with me? I want to offer you a different question. Not what is wrong with you, but what exactly is this system doing to you? Because what I want to show you today is that the dissatisfaction you feel isn't a character flaw, it isn't ingratitude, it isn't a spiritual failing. It's the predictable structural output of a specific social architecture, one that a French aristocrat named Alexis de Tocqueville diagnosed with surgical precision in 1840. And the mechanism he described is still running. You're in it right now. Before we get to Tocqueville, I want to spend a moment with the explanations you've probably already heard. Because they're not wrong, exactly. They just don't reach the thing. The first one goes like this. You should be more grateful. Your parents had it harder. Your grandparents had it harder still. You have a house, a car, central heating, a refrigerator full of food. Gratitude is the answer. The feeling of not enough is just a failure to count your blessings. There's something true in this. Gratitude is real and it matters. But here's what this explanation can't account for. The people who feel this dissatisfaction most acutely are often the most genuinely grateful. They say grace before meals. They know they're lucky. They've traveled enough to know what real poverty looks like. And the cloud doesn't lift. Gratitude is not the antidote to this particular thing, which tells you this particular thing is not ingratitude. The second explanation, it's a spiritual problem. You've drifted from God, or God has gone quiet, or your faith has grown thin with age, and the restlessness is the soul signaling its own emptiness. Pray more. Read more. Go deeper. Again. There's something real here. The inner life matters, and this channel takes spiritual questions seriously. But I've spoken with too many people whose faith is genuine and intact, who pray, who serve, who haven't traded anything away, and who still carry the cloud. If this were simply a spiritual deficit, you'd expect it to correlate with spiritual neglect. It doesn't, not cleanly. The devout carry it too. The third explanation is the most common in the media you probably watch. The country changed. The culture went wrong. Something was taken from you by people who don't share your values. And therefore, the dissatisfaction is appropriate. It's moral clarity, not weakness. This one is the most dangerous of the three. Not because it's entirely false. Things did change, and some of those changes were real losses. But it converts a structural diagnosis into a team sport. It tells you the cloud has a villain. And once you have a villain, you stop asking what the mechanism actually is. You stop looking at the architecture. You just point at the enemy. None of these three explanations is sufficient. And the fact that you've heard all three repeatedly, and the cloud is still there, that's the signal. You need a different level of analysis. That's what Tocqueville offers. Alexis de Tocqueville arrived in America in 1831. He was 25 years old, a French aristocrat from a family that had nearly lost everything in the Revolution. He came to study the American prison system. Officially, what he actually came to study was democracy itself, what it did to people, how it shaped the inner life of a free citizen, what it produced in the human soul over time. He spent 9 months here. He traveled widely, he interviewed obsessively, he observed everything. And when he returned to France and wrote Democracy in America, he produced something that most political books don't attempt, a diagnosis. Not a celebration, not a condemnation. A clinical examination of what democratic equality, at full operation, does to the people who live inside it. In Volume 2, Part 2, Chapter 13, a chapter with a title that should stop you, he wrote about why Americans are often so restless in the midst of their prosperity. He'd noticed something that puzzled him. He'd come from aristocratic France, where the social order was rigid. and suffering was obvious and close. He arrived in America, the freest, most prosperous, most opportunity-rich society on earth, and found people who were, in some quiet but persistent way, not at peace. He described it directly. "In America, I have seen the freest and best educated of men in circumstances the happiest to be found in the world. Yet it seemed to me that a cloud habitually hung on their brow, and they seemed serious and almost sad even in their pleasures." A cloud. 1840. He was confused by this at first. Then he understood it. And his explanation is the thing I want you to sit with, because it isn't what you'd expect. In an aristocratic society, the kind Tocqueville grew up in, your position in life was largely fixed at birth. The son of a farmer was a farmer. The daughter of a craftsman married a craftsman. The ceiling was low and clear and permanent. This was, obviously, unjust, but it had a strange psychological consequence. It set a boundary on desire. When you cannot rise, you stop measuring yourself against those above you. You compare yourself to your neighbors, your equals, your kin, and you can, in that world, arrive at a kind of contentment, the contentment of a completed life within known limits. Democracy destroys those limits. This is its great achievement and its great gift, and Tocqueville honored it as such. In a democratic society, every man can rise. Every position is, in principle, reachable. The barriers that once kept you in your place have been swept away. But here is the mechanism. And this is the thing Tocqueville saw that nobody around him was saying clearly. When every position is reachable, you measure yourself against everyone, not just your neighbors, not just your peers. Everyone. The man one rung above you on the ladder is now your comparison point. And so is the man one rung above him, and so on, without end. Tocqueville put it precisely. They have swept away the privileges of some of their fellow creatures which stood in their way, but they have opened the door to universal competition. The barrier has changed its shape rather than its place. The barrier didn't disappear. It moved. And now it's everywhere. What this produces, structurally, inevitably, is a form of desire that can never be satisfied. Not because you're greedy or faithless or ungrateful, but because the architecture of the system keeps relocating the finish line. You reach one level, and the next is visible. You reach that one, and the next appears. And because you can see, in a democratic society, exactly how far you could theoretically go, the gap between where you are and where you could be is always in view. Always. Tocqueville described the result. He grasps them all, but holds nothing fast, and so loses his grip on them one after another, while he hurries on to new delights. You've felt this. Maybe you hit a career milestone and felt the satisfaction last about a week before the next thing appeared on the horizon. Maybe you moved to the house you'd wanted for years, and within a few months found yourself noticing a different neighborhood. Maybe you retired with what you'd always planned to retire with and found that the relief you expected just didn't quite arrive. That's not ingratitude. That's the mechanism. Now, here's the part that a lot of people want to skip, but I need you to stay with it, because this is where the argument becomes something you can actually use. Is Tocqueville just describing human nature? Isn't this restlessness just what people are like always? The answer is, not at this intensity. And we have evidence. An economist named Richard Easterlin documented something in 1974 that has since been replicated so many times that economists call it a law. The American economy grew enormously across the second half of the 20th century. Per capita income roughly tripled in real terms between 1970 and the 2000s. By every material measure, food, shelter, healthcare access, life expectancy, consumer goods, the average American in 2000 was far better off than the average American in 1970. Happiness, by self-report, did not increase. In some surveys, it declined. This is not a spiritual claim, it's an economic data set. The Easterlin paradox, more wealth within a wealthy society does not produce more well-being. And the reason economists believe this is because well-being in a democratic, market-based society is determined not by your absolute level of consumption, but by your position relative to others around you. You don't feel rich because you have more than your parents. You feel relative to what your neighbor has now, to what the people you see on a screen have now, to the life you can see and almost touch, but don't quite have yet. In 2023, the Surgeon General of the United States issued an advisory, a formal public health declaration on loneliness. More than half of American adults report significant loneliness. The advisory noted the health consequences are equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And here's the detail that should stop you. The crisis is sharpest among the most connected populations. People with more access to technology, more options, more stimulation. Not less. The cloud Tocqueville saw in 1840 is now measurable in public health data. And then something happened that he couldn't have predicted, but that his logic points toward directly. And I want to be clear, this is my reading of his framework applied to our moment, not his words. The comparison that Tocqueville described, the structural, unending measurement of yourself against the next rung, was, in his day, still limited by geography. You compared yourself to your town, your county, your social circle. The comparison pool was real but bounded. What the last 30 years did, what screens and social platforms and global consumer markets did, is make the comparison pool infinite. You no longer measure yourself against your neighbors, you measure yourself against a curated, algorithmically optimized highlight reel of 8 billion people. The most successful version of every life you could have chosen is visible to you, in high definition, at every hour of the day. Tocqueville's mechanism didn't invent this, but it runs on it. The architecture he described, democratic equality plus universal competition plus the relocating finish line, now has a delivery system of unprecedented efficiency. The psychologist Barry Schwartz spent years studying what he called the paradox of choice, the empirical finding that more options, rather than producing more satisfaction, produce more anxiety and more regret. When you can choose from 5 things, you make a choice and live with it. When you can choose from 5,000, every choice you make is haunted by the 4,999 you didn't. Freedom of choice, beyond a certain threshold, produces not liberation but paralysis, and a persistent sense that the life you chose is somehow less than the life you could have had. This is not a moral failing, it is a predictable output of the system. If what you just heard named something you've been feeling but couldn't say, there's a companion to this that goes further. In the description, there's a workbook called Soft Despotism, a Field Guide. It takes the mechanism we've been talking about and walks you through 10 specific areas of life: healthcare, education, faith, family, finances, speech, where it's most likely operating right now. It won't tell you what to feel, it'll give you a way to look. The link is in the description. Now I want to give you the piece that changes how the rest of this sits. Here is what most people assume when they hear an argument like the one I've been making. Okay, so the system is the problem. The system needs to change. Or, okay, so the system is the problem. At least I'm not crazy. Both of those are partial. And I want to push past them to the thing that's actually more useful and more unsettling. The system isn't broken. That's the inversion. The dissatisfaction you feel isn't a malfunction of democracy. It's democracy functioning as designed. The engine of a free market, democratic society, runs on unfulfilled desire. It requires that you always want the next thing. It requires that no level of attainment feel permanently sufficient. A population of genuinely contented people is an economic and political problem. They stop consuming, they stop competing, they stop driving the growth that the whole structure depends on. Tocqueville wasn't making a libertarian argument or a socialist argument. He was making a structural observation. The same force that liberates you, the equal right to compete, to rise, to reach, is the same force that guarantees you will never feel finished. Not because you're doing it wrong, because you're doing it exactly right. You are the ideal democratic citizen, executing the code perfectly. And here's where it gets personal in a way that the political explanations never reach. You didn't fail, you didn't drift, you didn't trade your values for something empty. You built a real life inside a real tradition, with real faith and real love and real work. And the system that gave you the freedom to do all of that, the very system you believe in and would defend, came with something installed in it that you didn't agree to and were never told about. A mechanism that keeps the finish line moving. A mechanism that Tocqueville saw clearly enough to write a warning about in 1840 when the country was 60 years old and the warning was still young enough to maybe matter. It didn't change you. It ran alongside you. And for a long time, the life you were building was real enough that you didn't feel it that clearly. But at some point, maybe after the kids left, maybe after you retired, maybe just sometime in the last few years when the life you'd been building was mostly built, the mechanism became audible. The cloud became visible. And without a name for it, it felt like something wrong with you. It isn't. So what do you do with this? I'm not going to tell you the cloud disappears when you know its name. It doesn't. The mechanism keeps running, whether you've identified it or not. But there is something that changes when you have a name for a thing. The psychologists call it cognitive diffusion, the technical term for what happens when you can observe a pattern rather than just be inside it. The pattern doesn't stop. You just stop being entirely invisible to yourself inside it. When you feel the next rung appearing, when the dissatisfaction starts up its quiet work, there is now something you can say to yourself that is true and specific and rooted in something deeper than a motivational poster. You can say, "This is the paradox of equality at work." Tocqueville predicted this. This feeling is structural. It is not the final word on my life. That's not a cure. It's a compass. And a compass is worth more than a cure in country you're going to be walking through for the rest of your days. There's one more thing, and it's the thing I want to leave with you. Tocqueville wasn't hopeless about what he described. He was clear-eyed. He didn't dress the wound in cheerful language, but he believed there were forces that could hold the mechanism in check. Local associations, religious communities, relationships that weren't organized around competition, friendship, the kind of belonging that doesn't ask how you rank. The antidote to the unending comparison, if there is one, isn't more discipline or more gratitude or a better enemy to blame. It's the quieter thing, a life that has some relationships and some practices in it that are organized around something other than where you stand relative to everyone else. You probably already know what some of those are. The cloud won't lift entirely, but it lifts some when you're in a place where nobody is keeping score. If there was a moment you first felt it, the sense that you'd done everything right and still couldn't shake that background restlessness, I'd like to know when that was for you.